from extremely foggy Colorado. We are continuing kind of a two-part one here and something that's going on with the Chinese and their inability to govern or enter into negotiations. So the new news from the 5th of July is that the Chinese are restricting exports of a couple of materials to the United States, materials that are used in green technologies and semiconductor industries, specifically germanium and gallium. Now, for those of you who've been following me for a while, you know that when it comes to things like rare earths, I'm really not concerned because all we have to do is kind of turn on the processing capacity that we've already built, and then within a few months, the Chinese supplies don't matter at all. This doesn't fall into that category. Gallium and germanium are not rare earths. They're co-produced with other ores, so it's not that the extraction is particularly difficult, but this is something where we would have to build up the processing capacity first before we can get around this being a problem. I still don't think it's a major problem for two reasons. Number one, for people who are willing to admit that it's something that's becoming increasingly obvious, the bilateral relationship between the United States and China is hostile. It's becoming more hostile by the second, and the incapacity of the Chinese system to even enter into meaningful negotiations means it's only going to get worse. Part of the issue is that Chairman Xi has so purged the system that China's not even capable any longer of having good faith negotiations. And even if it was capable of good faith, it couldn't handle the technical details because Chairman Xi would have to do it personally, and then he would have to implement it personally because he's purged the system throughout China of anyone who is even marginally competent. So the capacity of China to even act as an actor, much less a good faith actor, is pretty much fallen away, which leaves us with things like this germanium and gallium ban, because this is like knee-jerk, grade D minus, not even freshman level economic coercion. The Chinese said flat out that this was a hostile move designed to punish the United States and that more was coming. But when you look at what's going on, you'll see that it's not something to be all that worried about. Now, germanium and gallium, the Chinese, based on whose numbers you're using, produce between 50 and 80% of those two materials. And yes, the United States does have a weakness in terms of processing and access, but a few things to keep in mind. First of all, germanium is a byproduct of zinc mining and zinc refining, and zinc production globally is pretty robust. Yes, the Chinese are the biggest player, but they're also the biggest user. So if you were simply to add some processing capacity at a half a dozen places around the world, maybe a couple in the United States would be nice. That would solve itself. Gallium is a byproduct of aluminum production. Specifically the first stop of aluminum production where you turn bauxite into alumina. That is also done in a number of places. The reason that the Chinese dominate the production of these two micromaterials is that it's a little dirty, and so the Chinese have just subsidized the production of that specific set. There's nothing expensive or technologically competent or even particularly time-consuming about building replacement capacity. And so we might have some pressure for a few weeks to a few months as people kind of sink in how serious the Chinese are or not about these bans, but replacing those materials is not particularly hard. Second, I would argue that this is a good thing that the Chinese are using a complete lowball, flunky, incompetent measure of intimidation because, Americans are going to blow this out of proportion. Things like the IRA and the CHIPS Act were raring for a third one that is specifically about strategic materials production. And this plays right into that political drama. You'll have Democrats and Republicans falling over each other in order to put the money forward and put in regulations to encourage these productions within the North American system. And the Chinese have really proven to be very helpful in that. And third, and most importantly, if the Chinese really are serious about an input war, oh my God, they are fucked. Because 90% of the world's semiconductor-capable silicon comes from North freaking Carolina. And so if we're really talking about a materials war as part of the struggle for the digital age, they're not going to have computers because they can't get access to the raw materials that are necessary en masse to make the most basic technologies that make the era run, and that's semiconductors. So this is not something where the Chinese have any more than a passing advantage in a couple micromaterials that are easily to produce in other places. And by doing this in this way, in this in-your-face wolf warrior way, for something that ultimately is easily replaceable is probably the most effective way that I can think of getting the United States past dependency on the Chinese in general, and honestly destroying their tech sector in its entirety. Now, there's some political decisions that have to be made in the United States on both sides of the aisle, on Capitol Hill, in the White House, and on and on and on. But the United States is in the mood for this. The competition, now that we're entering political season for the next election cycle, is who can be most anti-Chinese. It's just a question of whether or not you're going for decoupling or de-risking or resourcing. I mean, everyone has their own preferred term, but the bottom line for almost everyone is how to end the dependency. And the Chinese are really being very helpful in encouraging us to move that forward. All right, that's it. Take care. It doesn't really matter where I am because you can't see a damn thing. Anyway, today is the 5th of July, and within the last few hours, the Chinese have flat out canceled the upcoming summit with the EU Foreign Minister Borrell. For those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that I'm not very impressed by the quality of China's leadership of late. Chairman Xi Jinping has established such a cult of personality that no one will bring him any information. He's shot the messenger so many times and purged the system so thoroughly that anyone across the entire country who is capable of independent thought and is willing to share independent thoughts is dead, imprisoned, exiled, or worse. And as a result, the government has become a one-man show. If Xi doesn't say that it's going to happen, it doesn't happen. And that means whenever there's any sort of adjustment that is necessary for the ship of state at any level, everything gets frozen, either in a cult of personality where it just becomes this allergic scream of blind, idiotic Chinese nationalism, or things just don't happen at all. And that's exactly what's happening with the EU summit. And I think the best way to compare this is to what happened to the Blinken summit. Now, Tony Blinken is the American Secretary of State, and a couple weeks back he went to China, and it was the first meeting of anyone of substance in the United States with anyone of substance in the Chinese system since before COVID. The Chinese have been in lockdown for most of that time, and during that time, Xi completed his cult of personality and his purges and removed everyone who's capable within the entire system. So it was really hard for the United States to get any sort of read on what was actually going on in the country because no one in China would say anything because no one in China knew anything or had any instructions. So it was worth Blinken going to China just to kind of take the temperature of the regime. And reading the tea leaves and from what I've heard from folks in Washington, what happened was just there's a complete stall in government policymaking right up to and including the foreign minister. And knowing that is really useful for the United States. If China is completely incapable of governance, then you should expect to see a mounting series of ever more serious foreign policy and internal policy disruptions, mistakes, and collapses. We're seeing some of that. We'll talk about another one of those with the next video as regards to economic issues. But back to the Europeans. The Europeans are in the process of trying to rejigger the relationship with China, and they're trying to find a third way. The first way is what they've been doing so far, where they just kind of roll over and let the Chinese do whatever they want. The second one is the more American style, which is a little bit more in your face and more direct and confrontational. They're trying to find something in the middle, and it's not clear that there is a path there, but, you know, the European thing is to try for a third way on everything anyway. Now, Borrell. The European foreign minister doesn't go anywhere alone. There's a number of representatives of the Commission, there's representatives of the national government, there's a small fleet of bureaucrats. One of the things that most foreign powers find really problematic and frustrating about the Europeans is everything is about the EU bureaucracy and going through layers of approval that involves the French and the Germans and everybody else. And that's before independent countries put intelligence agents as part of the delegation, especially in the case of Germany and France and Sweden and the Netherlands and Denmark and Romania and Belgium. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a few of the high-up ones. Europeans are pretty good at this. But mostly you're talking about a small army of bureaucrats there to renegotiate every possible bit of minutia that makes up the relationship. This is what makes Europe go, the bureaucratic minutia that allows them to kind of act as a sovereign country, like a single country, but mostly is about creating a webwork of relationships and interlinking bureaucratic regulations in order to stabilize the relationship. If you're not European, this is frustrating as hell. If you are European, this is how we make the system work. And there is nothing about that system that works with a cult of personality where only one person can make the decisions. So regardless of what the goal of the Europeans was here, there was no way that the Chinese system was capable of engaging with Europe competently, because there's no way that one person could manage this sort of interaction. And in the case of the Europeans, they were going to bring everything. And in the case of the Chinese, they could negotiate nothing. So the Chinese were left with a very simple choice. Face the Europeans with an American-style wall of just hostility, or cancel the meeting. And so they canceled the meeting. And it's probably never going to have another one again, because for the Europeans, this is how they normally operate. And for the Chinese, they are now completely capable of carrying out complex negotiations of any sort. And as long as that is the case, there's no point in meeting in the first place. So it will be up to the Europeans, if they're talking with the Americans or other foreign powers or among themselves, to figure out what happens to the bilateral relationship with the Chinese when the Chinese are not capable of engaging at all. That's going to be a topic for another day. But anyway, next topic, we'll talk about some of the economic things that the Chinese are doing in this mood of a cult of personality. All right, bye.